By the summer of 1943, the once untouchable leader of Fascist Italy, Benito Mussolini, had fallen from power. Arrested by his own king, Il Duce was held in secret locations across Italy and cut off from the outside world, to whose eyes it seemed his reign was over for good. But the Germans had other plans. In this video, we'll explore the remarkable wartime footage of the actual operation, and with satellite imagery, unique archival material, and by comparing the memoirs of those who were there, uncover the true story of Operation Eiche. By July 1943, Italy's wartime situation was bleak to say the least. With total defeat in North Africa coming that May, the Allies turned up the pressure with heavy raids on mainland Italy's major cities, and then Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Something had to change, and so the Fascist Grand Council met on the 24th of July. Their agenda? Restore pre-fascist order and return supreme military and civil power to King Victor Emmanuel III, in essence ending Mussolini's 21-year rule and, importantly, perhaps, Italy's part in the war. At 2 a.m. on the 25th of July, Mussolini's fate was sealed. Despite a passionate defence, the council voted 19-8 to remove him and installed General Pietro Badoglio in his place. Hours later, the king ordered Mussolini's arrest. News of this political bombshell quickly reached and infuriated Hitler. He had long worried that the ever-weakening Italians might pull out of the war, or even worse, join the Allies. If Italy in fact switched sides, Germany would effectively lose 80 Allied divisions and be forced to stretch its already hard-pressed forces to breaking point. In a matter of days, Hitler gathered his chiefs of staff and put his plans on the table. 1. Reoccupy Rome and disarm the Italian army. 2. Destroy the Italian fleet to keep it from Allied hands. And 3. Reinstall Mussolini as head of a fascist puppet state. It's this last point that we'll be focusing on. It's fair to say that, for Hitler, rescuing Mussolini was as much an emotional choice as it was strategic. He didn't want Mussolini, a personal friend, handed to the Allies, put on trial and humiliated. Added to that, operationally, an ally was essential if the Germans were to end up fighting a three-front war. But how would Hitler aim to free Mussolini? Enter Operation Eiche, or Oak. At that point, the plan was as simple as locating and rescuing Il Duce, which of course is easier said than done. Knowing the value of the prize now in their hands, the newly installed Italian government suspected that the Germans would launch a rescue operation of sorts, and so, to prevent this, Mussolini was moved from island to island and prison to prison on a regular basis. If Oak were to succeed, the Germans needed someone to pinpoint Mussolini's precise location. Someone like Otto Skorzeny. Born in Vienna to a middle-class military family in 1908, he studied engineering at the city's University of Technology. It was there as an avid fencer he received his famous Schmidt's dueling scar. Once war broke out in 1939, he attempted to join the Luftwaffe, but was deemed too old and too tall, standing at 1.93 meters. And so he joined the SS. He would see action on the Eastern Front from 1941, receiving both a serious head wound and an Iron Cross in combat. Let's pause here for a second. This is where the legend of Skorzeny being the mastermind behind Operation Eiche comes into question. By consulting historical accounts and eyewitness testimony, it's clear that Eiche was in fact a Fallschirmjäger-led operation, with the SS playing only a limited part. That said, Himmler and Goebbels both knew the propaganda potential of a raid of this scope and scale, and the well-known, die-hard party member Skorzeny was the ideal person from their perspective. It's important to keep this in mind, as the operation effectively helped write the myth of Skorzeny's moniker as Europe's most dangerous man. While we reiterate that Skorzeny would only be tasked with locating Mussolini, the actual planning and eventual execution of the operation will fall squarely onto the shoulders of this man, Major Harold Moors. Born in Egypt in 1910 to a Swiss mother and German officer father, his family moved to Berlin in 1923. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1934 and steadily rose through its ranks, seeing action on the Eastern Front, in Greece and Italy. By 1943, after a time on General Kurt's student staff and earning his admiration, Moors was entrusted with planning the operation. It's with these men that we'll explore and compare accounts to uncover the true tale. Returning to our story, in the days since receiving their orders, Mussolini had been on the move. First, he was taken from Rome to the port of Gaeta and arrived at an isolated house on Ponza Island on the 28th of July. Then, on the 7th of August, was again transferred via destroyer to yet another island, La Maddalena. All the while, the Germans were hot on their heels, often missing Il Duce by just a few hours, until finally, on the 8th of September, SS Obersturmbannführer Herbert Kappler, commander of the SD in Rome, intercepted a coded message addressed to Italian police chief Carmine Senesi that read, "We have finalised the security measures at Gran Sasso and its surroundings." This was the break they'd been waiting for. It turns out that Mussolini was being held at an isolated hotel right here on Gran Sasso in the Abruzzi Mountains, roughly 110 kilometres northeast of Rome. Let's take a look to understand the terrain and their target better. By swooping down and using Scorzeni's reconnaissance notes from 2 flights he personally made over the target area on the 8th of September, we can get a glimpse into why the Italians thought it would make a good place for hiding. Built in 1936, the impressive Hotel Campo Imperatore rose 4 stories high and contained around 45 rooms. But most obviously, it was located atop a plateau some 2,100 metres above sea level. To complicate the situation even more, the main compound could only be accessed via a single cable car that docked at the town of Assergi below. Over and above the natural challenges, one of the major advantages the hotel offered its defenders was its placement, which offered excellent views of any possible approach, providing ample time to spot and react to approaching danger. Turning our attention to the compound and referencing archival images from the period, we can see that the area around the hotel was relatively sparsely populated. Besides these scattered outbuildings and the cable car station that leads down the valley to the town far below, it was defended by some 100 Italian carabinieri, with another 100 defending the lower station. When combining that defence with steep rocky slopes in all directions, it became clear to German planners that only 2 real possibilities existed. 1. Descend by parachute onto the complex, or 2. Attempt to land via glider. Considering these options, General Student and Major Moores were apprehensive of a paratroop drop. Surprise and accuracy were the name of the game, and with a drop, the men would end up scattered all over the mountainside and take time to assemble and begin their assault once on the ground. On the other hand, a glider landing also had its share of challenges. As we can see from this satellite image, seemingly there was not enough clear space to land near the hotel, and besides, the thin mountain air might not be conducive to an effective glider operation. Added to that, with men bunched together in fragile gliders, when things went wrong, they tended to be catastrophic, often leaving no survivors. That said, if successful, all troops could immediately launch an attack, and the element of surprise could likely be maintained. Ultimately, the Germans opted for a high-risk glider assault. Scorzeni, whose memoir needs to be treated with extreme care, recalled the mood in the German camp. Carefully weighing our chances, my adjutant and I came to the disheartening result. We could only even give ourselves a very slight chance of success. But the order was there, and we were soldiers and must carry it out. I went to my men and lined them up. I told them I was expecting in the next few days an order to undertake a most dangerous mission, and that we stood a damned small chance of pulling it off and surviving. It's fair to say that this sentiment was shared by Moores, but for very different reasons. Upon his initial briefing, he pointed out that the maps and reconnaissance images were outdated. More so, he felt that the information was all based on vague assumptions, leaving massive what-ifs and uncertainty. He recalled that interaction. When I had all the available materials in front of me, I discussed the matter with the student's intelligence officer, Hauptmann Gerhard Languth. The information that we had to hand was old, and we were waiting a photograph of the terrain that Languth had taken that morning. Upon Moore's rather unimpressed reaction to the intelligence, Languth responded by saying that all the information they possessed had come from Scorzeni. Here's Moores again. It was the first time that I'd heard anything about the notorious Scorzeni, a very reserved and self-assured man who had been roaming the general headquarters for some time. No one knew what he was doing there, except that he had received a mysterious secret mission from Hitler himself, and that he was an SS officer, but had to wear a Luftwaffe captain's badge for security reasons. Politics aside, the question on everyone's lips was, where exactly was Mussolini being kept? And was he really being kept at the hotel? The Germans needed to be sure. To answer that question, they came up with a plan. According to Scorzeni, he sent a German doctor up to the hotel to locate Il Duce. But according to Student, he sent his own personal doctor under the pretense that he wanted to see whether the hotel would make for a viable location to set up a hospital. In a short time, the doctor confirmed that Mussolini was indeed there, and it was heavily guarded. But where exactly? He knew that too, room 220 on the hotel's second floor. Armed with this new knowledge and the confirmation that Mussolini was in fact at the hotel, it was time to finalise the plan. As we know, it was already decided to assault Gran Sasso by air, and that will be done by flying in with 12 DFS 230 gliders, each towed by a Henschel HS-126 single-engined aircraft. The paratroopers, who made up the bulk of the assaulting forces, and the 16-man SS contingent would then overwhelm any resistance and make good their escape. The troops by vehicle, Mussolini by aircraft, which would arrive from Rome once the hotel had been secured. Simple, right? Not in the slightest. Besides the aerial assault, there was another half to this equation. The Germans needed to prevent any Italian reinforcements from spoiling the raid. But how would they do it? Well, by capturing and holding the cable car station in the valley below. That assault would be led by Moores himself. At the same time as the gliders would take to the sky, he and a ground force consisting of 90 well-trained Fallschirmjäger would make their approach from the south, all the while trying to avoid attracting attention from hostile Italian forces. Once the funicular station was secured, the ground team would stand ready to cover the escape happening on the mountain above. And so, at 6:15 a.m. on the 12th of September 1943, the men were assembled, last details were shared, weapons were checked, and the accompanying camera crew briefed. It was time, now or never. Glider pilot Sergeant Major Bernd Bosshammer, under the command of Georg von Berlepsch, who would lead the airborne element and was charged with landing his glider right next to the hotel, recalled that briefing. There on the runway, we saw Skorzeny for the first time, along with his men wearing the tropical uniform of the Luftwaffe. They were not wearing traditional paratrooper helmets, but rather the regular Wehrmacht ones. They were also not wearing jumpsuits, so they were easily recognisable. At around 10 a.m, General Student arrived. He talked with the officers, and here we learned that we were going to the Gran Sasso to free Il Duce. We were given express orders not to shoot, unless the Italians did so first. But there was a major problem. There were no gliders. Delayed en route, the assault party was forced to sit by for hours until finally, shortly after midday, the first of their transports appeared over the horizon. Bosshammer recalled that moment. To our surprise, we were worried to see that there were only 10 gliders instead of the planned 12, which meant that some of our comrades would have to stay behind. Nonetheless, a little under an hour later at 1 p.m, the roar of engines broke the Italian countryside silence as the leading aircraft with glider in tow disappeared into the clouds towards their objective. Weeks of planning and hard work were now going to be put to the ultimate test. At the same time, Moore's ground team were already on the move, with 20 vehicles heading towards their objective at the cable car station, with that moment actually caught on film in this wartime footage. In the distance, high up in the mountains lay Eiche's ultimate target, the Hotel Campo Imperatore. Having been on the road since 3 that morning, Moore's planned route was diverted by some 60 kilometres to avoid fighting that was known to have taken place in the area. This meant that instead of travelling 240 kilometres to their target, it was now a nearly 300-kilometre journey. Threading narrow mountainous roads and having avoided rousing the suspicion so far, the column reached the small town of L'Aquila, some 45 kilometres from the hotel, at around 1 o'clock. Trundling along, they were spotted by Police Prefect Rodolfo Biancorosso, who immediately radioed to warn Inspector Giuseppe Guerli, who was guarding the hotel. In response, Guerli ordered the defence at the tabletop car station to be stiffened, and when Moores and his men reached the bottom funicular station a little under 30 minutes later, they were immediately met with heavy fire by the waiting carabinieri. It was clear that the Italians had been expecting them. The paratroopers leapt from their vehicles and returned fire. With the cable car station only some 200 metres away, Lieutenant Weber took the lead. Rallying his men, he led a direct assault on their objective. With the Germans applying ever more pressure and converging from multiple directions, the Italian contingent fought back as best they could, with 2 men wounded by a grenade explosion and young Italian policeman Giovanni Natali guarding the cable car, falling to enemy fire. Overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the assault, the remainder surrendered. The first part of the plan a success. With no time to waste, Moores got his men to work, digging in and severing telephone lines, preventing outward calls for help from the hotel above. Now it was down to the glider men. Soaring high above their target and with the hotel squarely in their sights and tow ropes parted, the paratroopers readied themselves to come out fighting. But as the remaining 8 gliders, with 2 being lost en route, began their final approach, they ran into a problem. This grassy field that Skorzeny had earmarked as their landing zone was in reality a rocky slope with glider-crushing boulders. That field was located right here. It measured just 650 metres square, a very small target in the greater scheme of things. Having no alternative but to push on, the men braced themselves for a hard landing. One of those was Bosshammer, who needed to stop his glider right next to the hotel. He recalled those very moments. There was a strong pull on my glider when it touched down. The landing skates were covered with barbed wire and the braking parachute was also deployed. I hit my left knee on the edge of the glider and suddenly felt a strong pain. I also noticed there was considerable bleeding from the wound. In the space of just a couple of minutes, Bosshammer and the other 7 gliders came down in these locations, in and around Hotel Campo Imperatore, with one, in this approximate area, crashing, injuring all on board, but none fatally. Despite the hard landings, by about 2:05 p.m, the first troops, including an injured Bosshammer, poured from their gliders, ready to fight their way up the hill towards Mussolini. This fascinating clip, shot in the opening moments of the raid, gives us some idea of the mountainous terrain the heavily laden troops were up against. Interestingly enough, in this sequence, we can see this man carrying the FG-42 machine gun, in what will be their very first official use on the battlefield. With the camo-clad troops racing for the hotel, let's hear from Bosshammer as he made his way up the steep hillside. Every step I took was painful, but I had to continue with the mission. Our group's objective was to secure the rear exit. All of the Italian soldiers guarding Il Duce were visibly surprised, but no one made any effort to stop us. It turns out that no shot was fired for a very good reason. Skorzeny played his own ace. To the surprise of all involved, he had dragged General Fernando Soletti of the Italian African Police along for the ride. Soletti, after being captured by the SS while defending Rome, was used as a pawn that the Germans hoped would swing the operation in their favour. They thought that the general had the rank and respect that might just change the defenders' minds and stop any shot from being fired. They were right. With German soldiers to his rear, Soletti, now at the very entrance of the hotel, called out to the Carabinieri to lay down arms, threatening anyone who didn't comply with execution for treachery. Confused and demoralised by the sudden attack, and with their loyalties split between Mussolini and the new Italy, the defenders laid down their arms without offering any resistance, with some even seen smiling here in this film, showing their evident relief. Wasting no time, Skorzeny and his troops poured into the hotel and raced up to the second floor to capture their grand prize. Finding a solemn, unshaven Mussolini, Skorzeny reportedly said, "Duce, the Führer has sent me as a token of his loyal friendship." To which Mussolini is said to have replied, "I knew that my friend Adolf Hitler would not have abandoned me." And so, barely 10 minutes after the first gliders had landed, Mussolini was escorted outside by an entourage of jubilant German soldiers, the scene captured here for the newsreels. Bosshammer, who had witnessed unfolding events, recalled those moments. General Soletti stood in front of the hotel and ordered the soldiers not to shoot. Mussolini was peering out of a window on the second floor of the hotel. 10 minutes later, he left the hotel and remained in the main hall for a few minutes, surrounded by German and Italian soldiers. Skorzeny was behind him. I limped over to where they were standing, but stayed around 20 paces away. Exploring those captured scenes, we see that the news team, along with Major Moores, had both by now taken this cable car up the mountain, there to meet Mussolini and Skorzeny, whilst the assembled Fallschirmjägers began to clear a space as a makeshift runway. Next we see Mussolini, with Skorzeny by his side, making his way to a waiting Faisal Storch, brought in by General Student's personal pilot, Heinrich Gerlach. This famous shot, a smiling Mussolini with Skorzeny behind him in the aircraft, is a well-known one, but the blazing row that occurred moments before is not. Gerlach, a skilled pilot, was already concerned about the safety of taking off in an extremely light aircraft with a passenger aboard, and was horrified when he learned that the giant Skorzeny was also coming along for the ride. As usual, Skorzeny got his way, and moments later, this exact shot shows how the tiny plane and its precious cargo began its departure on the rocky slope. But conveniently, it cuts away before liftoff, probably because the struggling Storch almost immediately plummeted hundreds of feet into a ravine in an almost vertical dive. Only Gerlach's skill and strength managed to save what would have undoubtedly been a catastrophic crash with the deaths of all on board. But by nightfall, Mussolini and of course Scorzani were in Vienna, where the latter called Hitler and shared his news. Reportedly, the Führer was so delighted that he immediately promoted Scorzani and even ordered a nearby SS colonel to take off his own Knight's Cross and place it around the now Major's neck. The following day, this time aboard a Junkers Ju-52, Mussolini arrived in East Prussia, there to be met by his friend Hitler, with again the cameras present to capture the scene. Mussolini was free. In the days and weeks to come, Operation Eiche was hailed as a great success by Goebbels' propaganda machine, with these scenes shown to a jubilant public, a much-needed victory in a time where good news was becoming ever harder to come by. In all honesty, Operation Eiche was a daring and successful operation, but who really led that raid? According to Otto Scorzani, he did. In fact, in this film, taken in US custody on the 2nd of August 1945, he was asked that very question.
Did you take part in the liberation of Mussolini from Italy in 1943?
Har Sie teilgenommen in der Befreiung von Mussolini 1943? Ja, ich war der Kommandeur im Unternehmen. He was in charge of the operation.
This is provably untrue. He even goes on to give the numbers of troops involved as 50 SS, which is also untrue. The real mastermind behind the operation, captured here on film at the time, but who received little credit, was of course Harold Moores, who alongside his men had achieved a remarkable feat. Moores, after the war, retired to Bavaria, where he lived until his death in 2001. When asked about Operation Eiche many years after the war, he had this to say. Yes, it was the paratroopers who planned and carried out the operation, but for more than 40 years Scorzani has gotten all the credit. His version is something of a fairy tale. I'd like to see that remedied by military historians. Perhaps over the course of time it will be. In the end though, for Mussolini at least, those events in 1943 were no more than a stay of execution. Upon arrival at Hitler's Wolfslayer, he announced a new Italian Socialist Republic, in reality no more than a German puppet state. With hollow authority and under strict German control, Mussolini's second rise was powerless. His end, like Hitler's, would come in April 1945, when he and his mistress, Clara Petacci, were captured by partisans, executed and publicly displayed in Milan's Piazzale Loreto. A brutal end to Italy's once infallible leader. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, why not check out our dedicated podcast, World War II, Both Sides of the Wire. Join hosts Jesse Alexander and Professor Matthias Strone as they look at famous episodes from throughout the conflict from both an Allied and Axis perspective. Catch it right here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. That's all this time. We'll see you again soon.